Hi, let's talk a little bit about streaming music. This is the topic of your discussion where you were thinking about substitutes and complements. And we'll do it through the lens of what I think is a very interesting contemporary question. The prompt for this question was as follows. As you may know, the recorded music industry has faced some challenges over the past decade and a half. After the appearance of the iTunes Music Store in 2003, digital downloads, that is, permanent purchases of digital copies of recorded music, rose sharply. A new form of music consumption, streaming, has grown quickly since about 2008. Two of the largest streaming sites are Pandora and Spotify. I asked you to take a look at the annual report issued by the Recording Industry Association of America in March 2015. Based on the type of services that Spotify, Pandora, and YouTube provide, along with the data in the RIAA report, would you say that streaming music is a substitute or a complement for recorded music sales? Things to consider. Would you expect the various sorts of streaming services to have the same effects on music sales? Streaming services pay labels and artists for the use of music. If streaming depresses permanent digital downloads, i.e. iTunes sales, does it necessarily harm labels and artists? That was the prompt. So I want to talk in these slides a little bit about some background here and some of my thoughts on this question. So we'll start with some facts from the Recording Industry Association of America. One set of facts is just that streaming music revenues have risen really pretty rapidly in the past 3 years. Over on the left, you see the blue bar goes from 462 million to 733. That's sound exchange distributions. What that really means basically is a measure of Pandora usage. Then there's subscription services, which is basically Spotify, and that rises from 400 to almost 800 million over this period. And then there's on-demand ad-supported streaming, which is basically YouTube, and rises from 171 to 295 million over this period. So one clear fact on this slide is that there's been a rather large growth in the use of streaming as a means of being exposed to music. Now, the next thing to think about is sort of how might we expect these various different kinds of services to affect the demand for music. And when I say the demand for music, I mean the demand for permanent downloads. So let's take a quick field trip over to Spotify and Pandora and YouTube and just think about how the nature of the service might lead it to either stimulate demand for purchasing permanent copies of music or depress it. Maybe we'll start with Spotify. So let's take this field trip. Oh, here we go. Here's my Spotify account. Well, let's just see here. I actually have the premium service of Spotify, but with either service on your computer, you could just type in an artist. Oh, what's a nice innocuous artist? How about The National? They're a pretty famous band. Oh, look there. I can hear any song I want by this artist. Wow. Yep, any song I want. I won't play any because we don't have copyright rights to do that. But yeah, I could play anything I want. It's a jukebox with access to almost everything. Not quite everything, but almost everything. And I get to hear what I want to hear when I want to hear it. By the way, with the premium service, I can do essentially the same thing on a mobile device. So it's a lot like owning all the music under the sun, or I should say almost all the music under the sun. Let's compare that to a field trip over to Pandora. So here's Pandora. Here's my Pandora account. Now here, let's say again I like The National. So I can create a radio station called The National Radio, and it's going to play music. Some of it by The National, some of it by bands somewhat resembling The National, but it doesn't quite play exactly what I say I want to hear. Instead, it exposes me to some variety, and maybe it accomplishes what I want, or maybe it just teaches me about other music. That's our quick field trip over to Pandora. We could also take a field trip over to YouTube, except I seem to have closed YouTube, but let's open it again. Give me a second. There we go. So let's suppose I'm interested in a particular band. Wow, how did that happen? Here we go. Like I look up the band Cracker at YouTube. If I do that, they give me all these choices. I can hear most any song I want to hear by this band at YouTube. I've got to look at an ad probably as well. So it's in some ways more like Spotify than like Pandora. On the other hand, it's not clear I could do this on my mobile device. All right, let's finish our field trip. Hope you're not getting vertigo from watching this stuff move around. But again, the question we might want to think about is, do these various distribution channels for music, do they stimulate or substitute for permanent sales? That is, like, think about like those permanent downloads through the iTunes Music Store, where you buy a single for what used to be 99 cents and is now somewhere between 69 cents and $1.29. Now, why does this matter? In addition to being an assignment for a course that you're taking, and of course, therefore it matters, but it matters for some other important reasons in the real world. First of all, the payments to these rights holders. The rights holders are the labels and the artists. These payments to rights holders are the majority of the expenses at these interesting companies, Pandora and Spotify, something like half of their revenue, if not more. So it's a big deal for them. What is the process for the determining the rates? So, if you don't already know it, you now know it, that these rights holders get paid for the use of their music at Pandora and at Spotify, as well as at YouTube. At Pandora, the rate that gets paid is determined either by negotiation, or if negotiation doesn't work, then a compulsory license set by the Copyright Royalty Board, which is a court body that sits in Washington in the Library of Congress. At Spotify, the rates are determined by negotiation between the labels and Spotify. And it's a really big deal for both those distribution channels, Pandora, Spotify, as well as for the underlying rights holders who are concerned about the revenue they get from the various kinds of uses of their music. Now, how might we expect these various kinds of distribution services to affect? You might think that with Pandora, because it exposes you to music but doesn't give you quite exactly what you want, you might think that it therefore stimulates demand for purchasing music. Pandora, as part of the rate-setting proceeding, ran an actual A/B experiment. I'll give you a little excerpt from the call they had with investors. So their CEO was discussing what they had done, and I'll just read to you, but it says, Pandora undertook gold standard studies on 1,200 new and catalog tracks formed on our service, disabling certain music from playing for all Pandora listeners in randomly selected regions. As Dr. McBride explains in his testimony, analyses of record sales on these tracks indicated that Pandora is promotional for both new music and catalog by an average of 2.3 and 2.6% respectively. What he's saying is, when they turned the music or left it on, it sold 2 to 3% more than in the places where they turned it off. So that's kind of interesting. That says that it's a complement, not a substitute, that it's a complement for the sales of permanent downloads. On the other hand, Taylor Swift pulled her music from Spotify. You may have been paying attention a few months back when her new album came out. She said, you know what? I don't want my album to be on Spotify. So she took all of her music off of Spotify. Now, in some sense, this is puzzling. If you thought that Spotify had the same effect as Pandora and its studies show that its service has, you might think, wow, pulling your music off is like pulling your advertising. But that's not quite the way she thought about it. She thought, I think, that being played on Spotify would actually be a substitute for buying her music. But it's not clear, even if being on Spotify is a substitute, even if it does cannibalize some sales, it's not necessarily the case that it hurts the revenue. So let's think about this for a second. In the middle of this slide, there's a little formula. Revenue, and think about this as like the revenue you get from the sale and rental of your digital music. So you could think about it as your Spotify streams times the price per stream that you get, where a stream is when one person listens to one song, plus the number of digital downloads, that's like iTunes sales of tracks, times what you get for a sale of a digital download. So kind of summarizing that in notation, it's rev equals S for streams times PS, plus D for downloads times PD. Now, what do we know about PS and PD? Some of this stuff is kind of super secret, so we don't know exactly, but from various kind of press reports, you can get the sense that at Spotify, PS is somewhere between 0.6 cents and 0.84 cents, that is per individual listen. And PD, well, it's 70% of an average, the average price of a permanent download. So on average, that's about 82 cents. Now, here's the question that Taylor Swift and others had to answer for themselves. What happens to revenue when S rises? And the answer is it depends on whether D falls when S rises. Because if you think about the change in revenue, so this delta R, delta S, change in revenue with a 1 unit change in S, it's going to be PS plus the change in downloads with a change in S times PD. Or, looking at it right here, the change in revenue with a change in streams is going to be this 0.7 of a cent plus how much downloads change with a change in streams times 82 cents. Now the answer is going to be that revenue actually rises if this sum is positive. Otherwise it falls. So you can do just a little bit of math. And by the way, you didn't have to do this. I'm just doing this to show you some fun facts about the world. But it looks like revenue would rise if it takes more than 117 streams to displace a single track sale. Now, let's go back to the big picture. What's going on? Well, from the RIAA data that I gave you, you can see, as you saw earlier, that streaming is going way up. But at the same time, digital downloads, the red thing here, has been falling since 2012. It peaked at 2.9 billion in 2012. In 2013, it was 2.8 billion. In 2014, it was 2.6 billion. And although we don't see the data here for the first half of 15, it continues to fall. If you kind of add up the numbers, the sources of revenue from streaming and digital downloads, overall, it looks like a wash. Now, what does that mean? That means that there is sales displacement from streaming, but that the sales displacement, the rate of sales displacement is such that the overall impact on revenue is about a wash. Having said that, though, we don't want to over-conclude from that apparent fact that everything is a wash. It's very possible that there are big differences between types of services. I mean, we saw that here, for example. The Pandora evidence was that Pandora spins stimulate sales, whereas the overall data here seem to indicate that as one is rising, the other is falling, which makes you think that they're substitutes for one another. So there's very likely heterogeneity among types of services. Secondly, there's very possibly heterogeneity or different effects for different kinds of artists. It could be that for an artist like Taylor Swift, whom everyone knows, that there is less of a stimulating effect of being on a Pandora or a Spotify. So she would rather just go off those services and sell directly. Whereas for unknown artists, it's very possible that the exposure they achieve through either Pandora or Spotify or other types of services ends up acquainting people with them and stimulating demand. The jury is pretty far from out on all these questions. All right, so what do we conclude from this discussion? Or, I mean, you can conclude any number of things, but I guess what I would say is the following. First of all, whether streaming is a substitute or a complement for permanent music sales is a really important question for artists, record labels, Spotify, Pandora, and more entities. Second, the effects of streaming may differ between the so-called interactive services like Spotify and the non-interactive services like Pandora. And finally, this question is not really settled. I think it's going to be with us for a while as this industry, the various industries here really, one being the industry that records music and another being the industry that essentially broadcasts it. It's going to be with us for a while as these industries kind of settle out and converge and diverge and do all the fun things that new digital industries do.